Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for our Succulent Savvy workshop. Tonight's workshop is focused on exploring the many species of drought-resistant succulents, learning how to take care for, water, and design your own succulent garden. My name is Socorro Pantaleon with the Cucamonga Valley Water District, and I'm so happy to have this opportunity to host a virtual workshop for you. Joining me tonight in the main star of the show is Scott Kleinrock from Chino Basin Water Conservation District.
Tonight, we're going to really try to outline a plan for succulent success. There's so much to know. Fortunately, only a few things you need to know to be, overall successful. And then if you want to go deeper, I'll have a couple of other resources at the end. And then on the slide as we go by, there's also the links to where you can download or rewatch this. So first, we're going to talk about what a succulent is and why that matters. Then we're going to look at top succulent choices for home gardens. We're going to look at succulent planting and care. And then finally, we're going to look at garden design with succulents. And so let's get into it. And as we go, if you have questions, please type them into the question and answer. And I'm going to be keeping an eye on that. So periodically, if questions are coming in as we're in between some of those different sections of the workshop, I'll stop and answer questions as we go. And then if you have more questions, I'm perfectly happy to stay after 8 to make sure we answer everybody's questions. So what is a succulent? So there's a scientific definition and then there's kind of practical horticulture definition, but the Encyclopedia Britannica's definition is pretty good. It's any plant with thick flesh tissues adapted to water storage. So for some plants, that's the stems. For some plants, that's the leaves. Some plants, that's the roots, and some people do or do not consider those succulents. But for most of what we're going to be working with, it's the stems or the leaves. So for stems, we're talking about those big fleshy stems of cactus, of aloes. On the right here is a cut up aloe vera leaf, of yuccas in the stem. Aloes are the leaves more than the stems. I wrote that out wrong. So we have cacti and yucca is primarily for the stems. And so even though the leaves themselves aren't big and fleshy, there's water being held in that larger stem. The leaves are aloes, agaves. Agaves don't seem as liquid filled as aloes do, but those big thick leaves are water storage devices. And then some of the smaller, fleshier, softer succulents like echeverias and dudleas. And we'll look at examples of all of those later on. But they have adaptations for water storage. So why does this matter to us as gardeners in the Inland Empire area? Well, this succulents is most often an evolutionary adaptation to growing in a climate where the plant had to evolve to hold on to water. So that's often the arid or semi-arid climates. And it makes them easy and tough specimens in our gardens in our local conditions. It means that they are usually pretty flexible on when you need to water them. And if you're not the most attentive gardener or aren't always out there just in the nick of time to keep your vegetable garden looking good, succulents tend to be a lot more forgiving. A lot of them are also quite flexible on the amount of water they get and the schedule. This allows many of them to look quite good year-round with just a little bit of irrigation in the dry months, depending on the succulent, depending on how long it's been in the ground. We're usually talking once to twice a month instead of the 3 to 4 times a week where you need to water your lawn. Now, if you're watering your succulents once a month, you're probably also going to be watering a little bit deeper than just if you're watering your lawn once. But overall, you're going to be watering no more than 25% of what you would be watering a lawn to have a beautiful succulent garden. And you can get by with even less with most succulents if you really want to. And then one of the areas where they truly, truly shine is in containers. It can be really difficult to keep plants happy long-term over multiple years in containers in our hot inland climate, especially in summer. Things can stress really quickly. And succulents are just some of my favorite plants to grow in containers. Water them usually once a week at most, and you will be just fine, and you can enjoy their beautiful sculptural forms. But there are some common misconceptions about succulents. One of them is that some people just think that all succulents come from the desert. Some succulents come from the desert, but a lot of them come from other semi-arid climates. And so here is an example of a couple of different species of aloe in habitat in South Africa. We have a lot of great plants from South Africa, including the aloes, that grow really well here because South Africa is a lot of it is a semi-arid climate, just like our Mediterranean climate, what we have here. But it's not all true desert. So where a lot of aloes grow are actually in these seasonally dry grasslands. It's not all hot, blasting, true desert sun. Other misconception is that succulents can all grow in full sun. And in fact, a lot of our smaller succulents with the soft, fleshier leaves, like echeverias, will fry in full sun inland. And so a number of them are actually going to be a lot happier in part shade or afternoon shade. And then some can take that full blasting sun. And so as we go through a list of my favorite succulents for our local area, we'll break it down that way. And we'll talk about the ones that want full sun and the ones that really do better with a little bit of shade. I often see in home garden succulents that'll really perform a lot better in a little bit of part shade in full sun, and they don't look good this time of year. And sometimes they fry out entirely. And then the final misconception is that succulents don't need any water once you put them in the garden. There are some succulents that can survive just on rainwater after they're established, but any of them will still have an establishment period, and all of them will look a lot better if they get a periodic deep soak in the months that it doesn't rain. If we have a good winter, you might not need to water at all. And then something that I will say for everything that we're covering tonight is succulents are a very diverse range of plants. And if you go to like Cactus and Succulent Society's plant sales, or go to nurseries that carry really rare, sometimes very cool succulents, some of them can be fussy to grow. Some of them do want no summer water, but need to go dormant for a different amount of time. But most of the plants carried by most nurseries are carried by those nurseries because they're not only interesting looking, but they're easy to grow. And so we're going to talk about some generalizations tonight, which are going to apply to most succulents that you would get at any local nursery, but not necessarily every single one. So a couple of other non-desert succulents. Here are agave and Hespero yucca, which is our local, also called Our Lord's Candle, a kind of local strap-leafed yucca type plant. And those are ones that grow in California chaparral, which is very dry. But if you look at them, this isn't like no plants around it, all just rock, full blasting sun all day. And then even if we look out to something like true frying desert Arizona, it's not all gravel and cactus. And so it's very different than some of the maybe less than attractive front lawns that are taken out and it's all gravel of the same size and just a couple of cacti or succulents. That's not what we're going to be talking about tonight. Our local desert, Anza Borrego in the spring, is absolutely a gorgeous combination with some cacti, but also wildflowers and shrubs in bloom as well. And we even have in other non-desert areas. So this is beavertail cactus at Santa Rosa Plateau in Riverside County. And then our local softer succulents in much of California are Dudleas. And those actually don't like full sun at all for most of the species in the summer. And they grow in cool little places like cliffs, which are also usually facing north, so away from that full summer sun. And so doing just a little bit about whatever succulent you're going to be planting and the conditions it wants will really be the first thing that'll set you up for success. And so with that, we will talk about some top succulent choices for home gardens in our inland valleys and foothills. So basically, specifically where we are. There are many other great choices. There's no way in a 2-hour workshop we could cover everything. So I'm just choosing some of my very favorite top choices, which are also things that are commonly available in local nurseries that have a decent selection of succulents. And then beyond that, there's going to be hundreds of rare cultivars and varieties that nurseries may or may not have. So definitely, I would say don't limit yourself to what I'm talking about if you're new to this, but these are going to be some choices that if you like them, you can quite likely find them and would be good, reliable backbones for a garden that includes succulents. One great place to learn about most of the top choices we're going to look at is the Inland Valley Garden Planner. That's a website that's set up by our agency, the Waterwise Community Center, and you can get to it at inlandvalleygardenplanner.org. And I'm going to quickly jump there to show it to you because it is a pretty extensive resource that will be useful for succulents, but also goes well beyond that and provides a lot of information in more depth than what I can provide this evening. And so from here, if you're working on a garden project and it's kind of overwhelming and you're not sure where to start, you can jump directly to garden styles, where we have multiple themed palettes of plants that are already coordinated to look good together, to want the same amount of water, things like that. And so 2 of them have a significant amount of succulents. One of them is the colorful desert garden, and that's a mix of succulents as well as native desert shrubs to provide a balance between the succulents and then flowering material that looks great. And then another one is called the Succulent Sculpture Garden, which is mostly succulent based. Personally, I tend to like the look of the colorful desert garden a bit more. I think it gives you more tools to provide a balanced landscape. And then those desert shrubs, in addition to beauty, also attract a lot of pollinators, butterflies, hummingbirds, and things like that. So I think it creates a really nice dynamic garden. So whichever palette you're interested in, there's a description of what that kind of garden would provide for you. And then a plant list that would include coordinated trees, shrubs, and then of course, succulents. And each one of these then has its own profile where you can get pictures, a description, watering schedule, the basic information, height, width, what kind of sun or shade it needs and is adapted to, any other cool things like if it attracts hummingbirds. And then finally, even though maintenance is quite low for succulents, and the vast majority of the plants that we've selected to be on here, we have profiles of our top 350 plants for inland gardens. You do need to know a little bit about maintenance, like when to prune back the flower heads, things like that. And so you also get the maintenance for what you might eventually have to do, and then some other lists that would be associated with this plant. And so that's if you go to the garden styles, but the real heart of this website is the plant finder, where you can tell it what you want on multiple accounts. So example, if you want a succulent, so now you go from 350 plant profiles to 50. What if you have a part sun area where you want a succulent? So now you get to the 27 ones we have here that are good for part sun. And you can then go down from there. Also, it happens to be a small space. And so now you can look at individual profiles and learn about them from there. If you want to, you can also sign up to create a login. And with that, you can save your own lists and do some other cool features on the website. So we're always adding additional features. This hopefully late fall, we'll have a big additional section going up about landscape design. So please take a look at it and check back and let us know if it's working for you. So with that, let's jump back in and actually go one by one through some of our favorite succulents. So we're going to start with the succulents that are going to be good in what most people around here have, of full sun to full blasting sun. And full sun doesn't need to be all day completely. Full sun is defined by 6 or more hours of direct sunlight. So that can be areas that get morning, midday, and early afternoon, and then some part of the day it's shady, or maybe a little bit of morning shade. And then some of these will also work well in the shade. So first one we're going to start with is just a classic. It's common, but it's a great landscape plant and it's useful to have around at home, is aloe vera. This can take full sun to significant shade, and it grows in clumps. And so when you plant it, originally, it's just going to be one of these what are called rosettes, and it will slowly offset and clump out more, and then it gets these beautiful yellow flowers that the hummingbirds love. You can thin them as needed, so you can literally just get in there with a shovel or even an old like bread knife or something that's serrated, and cut off, if you have too many clumps, cut off as many as you want, and then you can replant those or share them with friends and get more plants. Lots of the aloe species have orange to red flowers, and so the yellow flowers are also nice because they provide a nice contrast. And they work well as individual plants and clumps, but they can also be really dramatic. We'll see some pictures later if you just really commit and do a whole large drift of that, either along a path or a background, and really make a statement with many aloe vera. A smaller aloe, kind of distant cousin, is blue elf aloe. That's one that's become more and more popular. You can often find it in local nurseries now. It's almost a ground cover. It's another clumper. So it's a bunch of little rosettes. And so with that, after you've had it in the ground for a little while and it starts to do that, you can easily divide it and again, replant them elsewhere or share them with friends. And they're hummingbird magnets like all of the other aloes and can take full blasting sun to part shade. And so as gardeners in Southern California, if we look at areas like what we would put in if we take out the lawn on our parkways, our kind of narrow areas along the street that do get a lot of sun and heat, this blue elf aloe is one of the small plants that can really take the heat. And so that's really a good choice to go to or mix into the palette. From some full sun aloes, I'm going to switch to some agaves. So for those of you who are new to succulents, aloes, they both generally have that rosette type form. Aloes tend to have fleshier leaves, don't normally have sharp points. Sometimes there's little serrated edges on the edges of the plants, but they're not the real sharp ones. The agaves tend to be the leaves have a thickness, but they're less succulent-like, and they are the ones that tend to have points on the edge and or along what's called the leaf margins, along those edges of the leaves. The agaves are from North and Central America, and the aloes are from South Africa. So blue flame agave is a medium-sized clump-forming agave. It's going to generally be about 3 feet tall, to one clump could be about one rosette can be about 3 feet wide, but then it'll clump and it'll get larger. It's kind of just like that aloe vera. Using a number of them can make a really great knee-high background next to other succulents. It has this very dramatic arched form that you can see here, and that really nice kind of light grayish blue color. And of all the agaves, it's one that's less what's called armed. So the spikes are not quite as bad. There's only little spikes along the leaf edges and they're not that sharp. And so it mostly just has that one terminal spike on the end. And if you're wary of that, or if you have little kids but still want to garden with something like this, what you can do is you can come with a hand pruners and you can actually just snip off the end of each one of these. You don't want to cut down into the leaf, but if you just take off like 1/4 of an inch on the end, that's the real sharp part. It's going to be a lot less sharp once you get past that. And so you still want to keep it into the black part. And that's a trick you can use on any agave that you would want to. And this one is good in full blasting sun to part shade. And then I really like the look of this and a larger background used with the blue glow agave. This is aesthetically, in terms of the what it does in the garden, this is probably my favorite agave, and it's a small one. It's normally no more than 2 feet wide, occasionally to 3 feet, and it's a very symmetrical form. So usually, however wide it is, it's going to be that tall, and it catches the light with these glowing leaf edges. So you can see that yellow right there, and you can look at other pictures online if you're interested in this plant. That is actually the leaf edge, while still firm, gets a little bit thin, and it has that yellow color and just a little bit of red along the end. And so if you put it somewhere where you'll see it during part of the day with the light low in the sky, either in the morning or the afternoon, it's just gorgeous. Be sure to plant it where it can have its natural form. So you can see I wouldn't put them any closer than these are. I'd actually like to space them apart a little bit more to really enjoy that. but it works well either as a single specimen or in groups. And this one works great as a potted specimen as well, because it doesn't form clumps, which is sometimes called offsetting or forming pups. It will stay this completely singular, perfectly shaped rosette. So that's blue glow agave. One of the important differences between the aloes and the agaves is that after they, either their first year in the ground or after they grow for a little while, aloes will bloom every single year, and then those blooms fade and you just cut them off. Agaves are very sculptural. Agaves will not bloom every year. In fact, they'll wait a number of years. A lot of smaller ones, it might be 7, 8 years. The larger ones, it could be 25 years or sometimes even more. And then they'll send up a huge bloom. So even for a small one like this, you can get a 7, 8 foot bloom. It will be glorious. But after that bloom, the lower plant will die. Now, with some species, there will form, even if it hasn't done so already, as it's doing that, it will form those offsets or pups. And so even though the main plant might die, you might have 5, 6, 7, or 20 little plants that you can then dig up and reroot it to replace it. Occasionally, some of them will also form pups, like actually in the flower part itself, which will be tiny, and you can pop them off and plant them or put them in some potting soil. And some of them, it's just going to be the end of the line. And so that will happen, but usually you've enjoyed them for a number of years and the investment is worth it. So that's something to be aware of with agaves. The botanical term is called monocarpic, meaning it will only flower once. But to have a sculpture like this in your garden for a number of years could be absolutely worth it. This is Queen Victoria agave, and this is just such a cool ornamental, almost geometric form. It works well as well in groups or as an accent. And this one very rarely offsets or pups. And so it's a great potted specimen as well. This one is usually smaller than 2 feet. Usually you don't see it any more than 18 inches. Foot to 18 inches is a good guideline. And so I like to sometimes use like that and that kind of mixed together in a zone as a kind of, not a formal pattern, but to provide contrast rather than just one. And it's a kind of echo with a looser geometry and a tighter one. And providing some contrast with that is red yucca. This is one of my other favorites for full blasting sun. And it is another one that's really great in parkways as well, where you have a kind of narrow space, but you still want to do something nice looking. This one is a clumper, but it's not spiky at all. It's the leaves are strap-like, and there's no spikes. There's just nothing you have to worry about. It has a long late spring through summer bloom season in full sun. It can grow in some part shade as well. You just won't get as many flowers. And hummingbirds absolutely adore the flowers. They're good as an individual specimen. This is a young one. Individual clumps will get maybe about 3 feet by 3 feet. But with that, it might look like one clump, but that's also offsets as well. And so if you want to, you can dig out clumps and then divide that to have more plants. And to really get the full effect, it's great in full sun. So here is a planting that I designed as a big drift, and it was just glorious in the summer. And then going down to the ground cover layer. Succulents can be very effective depending on how you set up the mulch, especially if you're working with gravels or decomposed granite, to have some space in between and not have ground cover. Or they can look great with ground cover in between. Or sometimes you need succulent ground covers in other spaces that are just kind of harsh, even if you're not mostly growing succulents. And so Bluefinger is probably the most common succulent ground cover you will see, for good reason. It's beautiful. That blue foliage really provides some really nice contrast with a lot of other plants. And it is one of those other very small plants. There's not a whole lot of ground covers that are going to be adapted to the harsh, full, like afternoon inland empire sun. And this is one that's just fine with it. So it's useful with many Waterwise garden styles beyond succulent gardens. And it spreads relatively quickly and is easy to plant from cuttings. And so at some of even the big box hardware stores, you can buy this by the flat and you just kind of pull it apart and divide them and then plant them every, depending on how fast you want to grow in, every 2 feet to 4 feet. Or you can just ask a friend who has some if you can take some cuttings and just root the cuttings. And we'll look at an example of how to do that later on. And they can also go all the way into part shade or even significant shade and be perfectly happy. They're very adaptable plants. And then another one of my favorite succulent ground covers would be orange ice plant. This one also provides a contrast. So you can use these two together in a garden. It has a smaller green foliage. And then when it blooms, it's just covered in the blooms. And butterflies are quite fond. So it'll bring butterflies into the garden to drink the nectar as well. Spread significantly, so one plant can get to 4 feet easily. And it can also be purchased in flats and divided, just like the blue finger. And this one will also spill quite nicely over wall edges. So this would continue to grow down over that wall, or you can put it in a container, maybe with a taller plant, and it will spill over the edge of the container. Question that I saw come in from Kira M. Can you use Euphorbia millii as a ground cover? Yeah, the euphorbias will work as a ground cover. They won't spread as much, so you'll need to plant more plants, but they're just fine. And euphorbias are a whole other group of succulents that I'm not going to talk about much this evening. They're really worth looking into. The only reason why I don't put them in some of my kind of favorite plant lists is because the sap, if a piece gets snapped off or cut, can be very caustic, and some people are very sensitive to getting it on their skin. So yeah, that's just something that keeps it out of my top plant list. But euphorbias are beautiful and really cool. Some are succulents and some are not. Some are some other just really beautiful Mediterranean climate adapted plants. Golden barrel cactus is an absolute desert garden classic. And that round shape provides really dramatic visual contrast from some of the more typical rosette-shaped succulents. They're slow but steady growers. If you want to and you have the budget, you can spend an arm and a leg on getting some larger boxed specimens. However, most people are going to want to plant them small and let them grow. And they're slow but steady growers. So if you have them for 30 years, they will start to be quite impressive. But even small, because of that strong shape, because of the color that the spines have, and they become beautiful flowering plants before long as well with beautiful yellow flowers. They're really nice garden specimens, and they can take that full blasting sun. And then a couple of larger full sun specimens. And again, there's plenty of other plants that could easily be on this list. Check out what's available at your nurseries if you're thinking about it. But a couple of my favorites that are very low maintenance and easy to grow. One of them is called Desert Spoon. It grows to 7 feet wide, maybe about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. And you really want to make sure it has the room to grow, because if you start hacking back the leaves to keep it contained, it's just going to lose that beautiful form. It's not going to ever look right again. And it's not spiky at the end, but along the leaf edges, it's kind of sharp and serrated. So you want to put it somewhere where you're not going to have to be trudging through it to maybe like clean your windows or something like that. And it gets those long, beautiful flower stalks. Full sun plant. And then another larger one that I'm fond of, this is a medium-sized one, so it'll get larger over time on usually a single trunk. Sometimes it'll be a multi-branched column. It starts just as a small rosette and then grows the stalk over time, is beaked yucca. And it also has really attractive blue leaves, and beautiful flower clusters that come every year, are absolutely loved by pollinators. So it's a slow but steady grower. So plant it where you're going to expect it to be small for a while and it'll look good. But over time, when it gets taller, it will also perform well there. Succulents, out of all kind of groups of plants, because of their adaptations, are relatively easy to move in terms of the plant doing well and being successful. However, once the succulents start getting large and you get a root ball with some soil on it, they do become a lot of work to move well. And the taller ones you have to restabilize. So I really encourage you to, for the ones that get larger, try your best to put them somewhere where you'll be able to leave it. And then my last from my top list of full sun succulents is the hardy spineless prickly pear. This is that classic paddle cactus shape, But this particular one, and if you're going to be looking for this one, I'd encourage you. In most of these where the Latin name, the scientific name is different from the common name, I've put that Latin name here. It's intimidating to most people, so I haven't even mentioned it yet. But occasionally, you're going to want to note this down because this name, if you bring it to the nursery, is the one that will give you the 100% positive identification. So this hardy spineless prickly pear is available, but not the most common one. But there's many other prickly pears. And so if you're interested in this one, you're going to want to bring that Latin name to make sure you get the exact right one. Reasons why I recommend this as one of my top plants for home gardens in our area, even though there's lots of different cool prickly pears, is that this one is almost completely spineless. Both the large thorns and the small fuzzy ones that are the worst ones to get in your skin, which are called glockids. Those are the ones that are like sharp hairs. I always encourage people to still be careful, but these are much easier to deal with. And the size is really nice too. Fully mature, they're usually only going to be 3 feet tall and 6 feet wide. So some of the prickly pears get huge. This one stays a pretty manageable scale for a residential garden. You get that nice dramatic form. It has a really nice kind of mid-tone green foliage, and then it gets beautiful yellow flowers and red fruit, which technically we can eat. Got to be careful when you're dealing with it. There's tutorials online if you're interested, but songbirds absolutely love the fruit. So I mostly just leave them for the songbirds. And it's a nice contrast to other plant forms. This can take full sun to significant shade, surprisingly, a surprising amount of shade. And so continuing to move on, we're going to look at succulents that can handle full sun, but they truly thrive with either afternoon shade or part shade. And the first one is the black rose aeonium. This is a pretty common plant because it's beautiful color and it's otherworldly looking. It has this outlandish sort of Dr. Seuss shape. The one that's been around for the longest is this one, the black rose aeonium. There's some newer cultivars. A common one is called Cyclops. It's very similar, but it has a larger rosette. And their dark foliage just provides really cool contrast. They're also great in container plants. They can take the full sun, but in the summer, they'll kind of go dormant. They'll look kind of shriveled up and dried. And that's just their natural response. That's what they do in their native habitat in the summer when they don't have access to supplemental water. But if you want to keep them really looking great in the garden and not doing the dormant thing, afternoon shade or part shade will really give them the best performance, or you can just let them go dormant in the full sun, either way. And then what will happen is they'll grow up and up and up, and eventually they'll get kind of stemmy or leggy with the rosettes at the very top. Now, if you use it as a background layer in your garden with other stuff in front, that might be the look you want. But if the look isn't what you like, you can easily just come along, snap off a bunch of the heads, leaving a few inches of stem on it, leave them in the shade for 3 days. So the part that snapped off starts to dry out, heal over, callus a little bit, and then just stick them back in the soil, and it kind of resets the whole thing. And then the foliage is closer to the ground again. That's best done and not in the time of year where they want to go dormant. So once you get through the summer and they kind of perk up in the fall, that's a great time to do it. And there's lots of other cool aeoniums to research, but this is the black rose aeonium. And then the other toughest, most common one is the Haworth aeonium. It's a common and easy ground cover. You commonly see it in succulent gardens. It's really great and looks really natural in Mediterranean gardens, along with like lavenders and santolinas as well. And very similar to the black rose aeonium in all the other care. This one is a lower, kind of tighter cluster, more of a ground cover, mounting ground cover. And then coral aloe is another one that can take growing in full sun, and in our demonstration garden we have some in full sun, but to look the best year round, it really likes to be in part shade or afternoon shade, or even some dappled part shade. It's one of the most common landscape aloes. It has single rosettes. It doesn't offset, or rarely does, but it's mostly single rosettes that are going to get 2 to 3 feet wide, so pretty large, and then it gets those very broad orange flowers. And then our last aloe is fan aloe. This is a really different one. That's a very cool specimen plant, either in the ground or in a pot. And it has these fans of these tongue depressor shaped leaves. It's very different than most of the other aloes. It's pretty slow growing to develop these trunks, but it looks good at all stages of growth. It looks cool even as a small plant planted from a 1 gallon. So put it somewhere where it can grow in over time and then just enjoy watching it grow. And then foxtail agave is another one that you see all around in gardens that are water-wise or with succulents for good reason. This is a truly spineless agave. It's soft. There's nothing to harm you. And the leaves have this soft, almost powdery looking texture. They're beautiful plants. They form large clumps over time. So this clump you can see here started off as one plant, but you can easily just chop off whole sections that you don't want. And so if this had gotten too large for you, you can cut off everything but whichever one you wanted. And those other ones, you can just leave, maybe 6 inches of trunk on it. Same thing as we talked about with the aeoniums. Leave it in the shade for a little while, 3 days a week, and replant it, and it will start growing again. They can grow in full sun in the Inland Empire, but if it gets afternoon sun, this time of year, some of the leaves will burn, and those individual leaves don't ever really recover once they're burned. Eventually they'll die and be replaced by new leaves. But to prevent that, afternoon shade or even part or significant shade will really keep them looking good. And then there's a few different cultivars that have blue leaves. One of them is called Bhutan Blue. One of them is called Nova. They're a little bit harder to find in the nurseries, but the specialty nurseries tend to have them, and they can provide a whole different kind of color. So depending on what other colors you're working with, you have some options for some contrast. And then we're going to look at some succulents for part shade. If you have part shade, one of my favorite are the echeverias. There's many, many different types of echeverias, so I'm not going to mention just one. Some of them are common, but there's so many different cultivars and different variations and combinations people have bred that I really encourage you just to kind of go to the nurseries and see what they have and see what catches your eye. They're all, for the most part, easy to grow. Some of them can handle a little bit more sun than others, but with the kind of inland heat we get, I really encourage people just consider them to be something that's either part shade, dappled shade, or really only gets morning sun. They're gonna kind of fry out or go so dormant that they're just really not gonna look good if they're in full afternoon sun. Most of them are small. Some will offset like this, which can be propagated and divided with just a small piece of stem, just like we've spoken about for the other plants already. If you want to plant a large area to this as a ground cover, that can get quite expensive, a 1 gallon plant at a time, because they don't get very big. And so a strategy you can use is to plant a few, and then as it offsets over time, you can take cuttings and then replant it over a number of years. There's also a really cool agave that I like that's really better in part shade in our area as well. And it's called octopus agave. You can see why. It looks like a sea creature. And it's really best in part shade to significant shade in our area. And it's another one, that's a typo, that has no spines, not so spines. So kind of like the foxtail agave in terms of the fact that it doesn't really have anything that's going to poke you, but it's one that has a very different form, but really does want a part or almost full shade to look great year round. And so with that, I'm going to look at some questions. If you have any questions, type them in. And after that, we'll go on to talk about planting and care. So from Chris and family, can I share more about the garden sales I mentioned in lieu of regular nurseries? Are there succulent exchange groups I know of? Great question, Chris. So the garden sales for succulents to keep your eye open for are ones that are going to be taking place at the regional botanical gardens. And so some of those are put on by the cactus and succulent societies, like the Los Angeles area has a very active cactus and succulent society that has a sale every year. And then a lot of the botanical gardens themselves, including the Huntington Botanical Gardens and Fullerton Arboretum, they have their own propagation nurseries where they will be propagating really cool stuff from their own collections. And so when they have their either annual or some of them have a fall and a spring sale, they'll put out some really cool stuff that can be very interesting and a little bit different you can get from the regular nurseries. And so I would just check the different botanical gardens around, and in the sources list that I present towards the end, it mentions some of those. This year, a lot of them have had to cancel or significantly modify their sales as pickup only. So definitely, I would say check in, because things are just all over the place this year, unfortunately. And then there's also a few very specialty succulent nurseries. One of them is called Cactus and Succulent Center. That's in the Pasadena area. It's pretty close to the Huntington Botanical Garden. So if you're super into succulents, you can go check out the Desert Garden at the Botanical Gardens and then hit up the Cactus and Succulent Center, or it's the California Cactus and Succulent Center. And then another one that I recently learned about is called OC Succulents, and that's in Irvine, and they're specialty growers as well. I'm sure there's more around. So if other people know of some that aren't on my radar or are less known, please type them in the chat and we'll mention them at the end when we talk about our other sources. And then Amy, before we go on, has entered another question. Succulents will never survive indoors, correct? Tried many times and they just died. It can be done, but in Southern California, it's easier to do it outdoors. If you're going to grow them indoors, you're going to want to have them in bright indoor areas, in a window that gets a good amount of sun. Definitely, they need more sun than a lot of houseplants. And then you're also going to want to research which ones do the best as houseplants. They become very popular houseplants in areas of the country and even in Europe where people can't grow them outside, parts of Asia as well. So there's a lot more information online in the last, I'd say 5 years or so, about what specific species do well indoors. And then the other thing versus other houseplants is a lot of people water them too much, and they absolutely need to have holes in the bottom of the pot to let the water drain out and not be watered too often. So it can be done. Personally, I just prefer to do it outdoors because houseplants take a lot more work than growing things outdoors here, especially the Waterwise plants. But I would say do some additional research online, but that's the basics. And Nancy commented that they've discovered some good succulent nurseries just north of Escondido. I wonder if that's in Vista. Vista, California has a lot of nurseries of all types as well down through Escondido. And yeah, sometimes if you go to the nurseries, no specific names from Nancy, but you can look up some regional stuff online. And sometimes the ones that are a little bit farther out, sometimes they're wholesale growers that will also sell to individual people who aren't professionals, and they sometimes have really cool stuff at good prices. Okay. And then last question before we move on is, do succulents flower more in the ground versus in a pot? I've never seen anything scientific on it. From my observations, I haven't seen much of a difference. Succulents do flower pretty freely in pots as well. A lot of them, if you look at where they're adapted to growing in habitat, this isn't for all of them, but a lot of succulents are very adapted to growing in small cracks in between rocks, some of them on cliffs, things like that, where they are making do in not a great amount of soil. This is definitely a generalization, but that's especially true of some of the smaller succulents that would be good specimens in pots. And so, not scientific, but just me kind of thinking maybe that's why it doesn't make that much of a difference. There are few plants that I like to grow in pots because I just find growing plants in the ground, if you have access to the space, to be much easier. And at this point in my life where I finally do have area where I can grow things in the ground and don't have to grow in pots, that's what I prefer. But succulents are one of the things that I still find worth growing in pots. And then from Brian, How do succulents do during the rainy season? That's a great question. We're going to talk about them wanting well-drained soil in just a little bit and what that means. But overall, most of the succulents that we will buy in our local nurseries, unless it's a specialty nursery selling something super rare, in which case hopefully they will inform you, do well in the rainy season here. There are some rare succulents that really don't do well in rain because the climates that they come from are different in terms of the rain patterns, and those would suffer, but those are the vast minority of things, and usually those are only grown by really enthusiasts who keep them in a little greenhouse in pots to keep them out of the rain. Okay, so with that, let's jump into succulent planting and care so we can keep going with the workshop. And then if you have more questions, just type them in. And even if we need to keep going, I will definitely make sure to have time to answer all questions at the end of the workshop. So planting and care for succulents is probably the easiest group of plants to deal with in terms of care especially. But whatever sort of plant you're planting, true of succulents, true of anything else, the best way to set yourself up for success is to do a little bit of research and make sure you're going to be putting the right plant in the right place. That is a mantra for my classes: right plant, right place. Most succulents, first thing that they need is good drainage. That means that when water goes into the soil is going to hold some amount of water, but it'll let it drain through. The soil's not going to soak there. Good news for most of you coming from the Cucamonga Valley Water District Service area is that most of you have pretty rocky soil or maybe sandy soil with a lot of gravel. All of that tends to drain very well. I know a couple of people that I've worked with in Rancho Cucamonga live in areas with clay soil, and there you're going to have a little bit more of a challenge with growing succulents in the ground. Good drainage, to quantify that, if you dig a hole or better, a number of holes in your yard, fill that hole with water twice and just let it drain through. The third time, fill that hole with water and time how fast the water drains out of it. If on average, as that water drains down, it's going 2 inches or more, so that hole is losing 2 inches of water every hour, you have good drainage and you should be able to grow succulents plenty well in the ground. If it's less than 2 inches per hour, between 1 and 2, you have medium drainage, and you can probably get away with some of the aloes and agaves if you're being careful. Less than 1 inch per hour, you are going to struggle growing succulents in the ground. And what you're going to want to do is, if you try it, I would say start with a few, maybe sticking to aloes and agaves at the beginning, and being very careful with when you water. Only water when the soil seems quite dry, maybe once a month after it's established, because I do know some people who grow a few succulents in like the heavy clay soil in Chino Hills, and they do all right, but you're gonna want to be very careful. In general, if your yard has slowly draining or clay soil, you are going to want to either plant in containers. You're going to want to build up mounds above the existing grade of the soil, which can be pretty nice in terms of landscape form and how it looks as well. And if you buy in your soil, which will be the best thing, you're going to be buying in some sandy loam topsoil, maybe with a little bit of compost mixed in. And so that will provide that good drainage to the upper roots. And you're going to want to make sure that you're planting mostly in that built up soil, at least with the root ball of the pot that you're planting. There are some people that will amend slow draining soil to grow succulents. Those are people who really want to put in a lot of work to grow succulents. They're very enthusiastic about it. Personally, if I had slowly draining soil, there are plenty of Waterwise, especially great, beautiful, low water, beautiful flowering California native plants that can handle clay soil. I would go with that for my garden, and then maybe mix in a few succulents in pots to get that effect or that sculpture. You will not improve your soil, and in fact, you will make it worse if you just mix in a dusting or 1 inch or 2 inches of sand or an amendment like decomposed granite. It will just kind of form more of like a concrete. If you are trying to amend your slow draining soil, some compost can help. Compost is one of the few things that can help, but it's not going to generally make so much of a difference that if you have slow draining soil, you can just go ahead and plant anything. If you're one of those people who's determined to give it a shot, you can mix in maybe a couple of inches of compost, 2 to 3 inches, mixed down, incorporated into a foot of soil. But for the most part, if you really want to change it, you're going to be doing something like mixing in by volume about 50% decomposed granite into your clay soil is something that I've read has worked for people. And then you'll have much higher volume of soil, and that's going to be at least a foot deep, minimal. So it's really a lot of work. Generally, what I encourage people to do, what I like to do for myself and consider to be part of sustainable gardening, is to go with what's going to work for your site and then do it well. If you are one of the people with clay soil, if you go to the Inland Valley Garden Planner website that I showed and the different factors that you can click to get results for what plants are going to work for you, there's one you can click that will make it show you only plants for clay soils. So that's something to kind of think about. And then the other big things for right plant, right place are going to be the sun and shade requirements of the plants you're thinking about, and also definitely how large it will get over time. There is a really beautiful, very sharp, but very beautiful agave called Agave Americana. It's a very common one, probably too common in landscapes because it's gorgeous, but it's going to be 7 to 8 feet wide over time. And you see it planted 2 feet, 3 feet off of sidewalks or paths all the time. That's a recipe for disaster after the first couple of years, because so much of what's beautiful about succulents is that dramatic sculptural form, and that doesn't take to being hacked back to not have its spiky leaves going into sidewalks. So research the full size of those plants and plant accordingly. And then planting. So succulents are very tough in general and probably are some of the most flexible plants in terms of what time of the year you can plant them. But ideally, no plant wants to be planted in full blasting sun in the middle of the summer. Right now, it's just too hot. I mean, chances are you might be all right, but it's just a recipe to stress out your plants. At this point, I would wait till the fall to do a major planting. With succulents, and then for most water-wise plants, Mediterranean plants, California native plants, I tell people absolutely don't plant right now. With succulents, if you need to do it, then in part shade, you can get away with a little bit more. If you need to put something in a pot, that's okay, especially if it's in part shade, but nothing really in full sun, ideally. And then if you're going to be planting in full sun, but if the plant was in shade underneath shade cloth at the nursery that you bought it from, it's good to acclimate the plant to its new home by starting it in the shade at your house for a couple of days, and then maybe moving it to a part shade area for a couple of days, then keeping it in the sun for a few days, and then finally planting it in full sun. And so we're going to do a quick walkthrough of planting a succulent plant from a container. This is a Dudleya. It's one of the California native succulents. And here is a section in my backyard, which I'm still building out the garden for, in which I'm going to plant this Dudleya. The Dudleyas mostly don't like complete full sun. They like some afternoon shade. And so I have a desert milkweed right here that's providing afternoon shade. And this is where it's going to be sited. And some of you who know how to plant plants know that succulents are maybe not that difficult, but a lot of people don't know what to do. So I'm just going to start with a baseline of assuming that you don't know anything, and we'll go through this quickly. But I want to make sure that if you're going to be planting things, you're going to be setting yourself up for success as much as possible. So here's our site. So starting with a standard spade shovel. And if I'm putting something down over mulch, what I like to do is I like to put my shovel down a little bit away from it, but to get it in the vicinity before then I move it off to the side and scrape up the mulch, because you never want to be planting in your mulch layer. You want to make sure you're doing everything relative to the soil, whether it's wood chip mulch, decomposed granite, gravel. We'll talk about mulches later. So clear that away, getting down to the actual soil. Ideally, you don't want to be planting in bone dry soil. It's harder to dig in. The soil doesn't crumble as nicely. Sometimes it happens, but if you have the ability to water that area deeply, then do so. If you have very sandy soil, maybe 2 or 3 days in advance. If you have clay soil, you're going to want to water deeply and wait probably a good week. But you want to make sure that area is not bone dry, that you have some moisture. And this is the kind of shovel to use for those of you who aren't used to digging around in your garden. This is a spade. You don't want to get a flat shovel and start trying to dig holes for plants with it, with the flat-edged shovel. It's going to not work very well, especially if you have any gravel in your soil. It's going to take way more effort. That's just not what those are meant for. You need a spade. And then you can see underneath that, I like to use gardening tubs. So especially if your area is already mulched, you have an existing garden, putting the soil into a flexible tub like that just makes life way easier, keeps the site way cleaner, and you don't get soil mixed into your mulch and all over the place. So digging out the hole, you're going to aim for your hole to be slightly less deep than your container and about twice as wide in general to give you some room to backfill. And so digging out what's roughly going to eyeball to the size of that hole. And a good practice is to then kind of poke and prod to fracture the sides of the hole. If you have sandy or rocky soil, this isn't as critical, but if you have clay soil, it is very critical because with clay soils, the actual action of the shovel against the side of the hole can actually align the clay particles to where you're almost forming a ceramic pot. That makes it a lot harder for the roots to grow out. And so after you do your digging, to then break up the sides just a little bit gives those roots really nice places to start to grow out. So following that, I just use my hand to flatten out the bottom of that hole a little bit. And then I, still in the pot, put that plant down into the hole to kind of test. And what you're going to be aiming for most succulents is to have the top of the root ball in the pot be inch and a half, maybe up to 2 inches. If you have soil that doesn't drain perfectly, I'd go up to 2 inches above the soil level. The reason why is because when we buy plants in potting soil, it's kind of a compost-based potting medium. And over time, that breaks down and it loses some volume. And you want to make sure that water is never draining and sitting at the base of your succulent plants. That can cause them to rot. So you want to have it be a little bit high versus a little bit low. And they don't mind being planted a little bit high. So that's just fine. And it protects it from ever ending up too low. If you plant it perfectly even with the surround, then it might end up low over time. And then that's harder to fix. So that's looking pretty good. Also take a look if there's any little weeds or anything like that. It's time to pull them out before it's in the ground and harder to do. And then you're going to want to carefully get the plant out of the pot and look at the side. Take a look at the roots. Now, this is not bad. This is actually pretty ideal. When you look at the roots of your plants, and this is something that I actually do in nurseries because I want to make sure that the plant doesn't have too many roots that have been growing in the pot for too long. What you want to see is that the roots have filled out the soil, so it's not going to fall apart. But there's not a lot of roots totally circling around and around and around in the pot. Plants that have been left for way too long, you might even see more roots circling around than soil. And what's going to happen is when this plant is planted, the roots that are already maybe circling will kind of continue to circle before they can easily find their way out of the planting hole. Or sometimes they'll just kind of keep circling over and over again, which can cause problems for the health of the plant long term. Something that we see oftentimes with big trees as well, and it can cause them to fall over in windstorms, all sorts of bad things. And so what I do, even for things like this, you always want to check the bottom as well. This is looking good, but sometimes there's a whole mat of roots at the bottom. What I do is first I will dunk, and I do this with all plants I plant, especially 1 gallon plants, not just succulents. unless the plant has underdeveloped roots to where the soil is just loose at the edges, I will carefully dunk it in a 5-gallon bucket of water, because you really want to make sure that when the transplanting process is happening, which can be stressful to plants, it has all the water it needs. It's not going to be water stressed at all. Then pull that out and let the water drain out some. And then I'll loosen those roots to make sure that they aren't going to be circling, but that they'll grow out in their natural pattern. And we want to make sure for our succulents and our water-wise plants that the roots can spread far and wide to find water wherever water might be available to them. So in this case, all that would be needed is a little loosening with the fingers. Sometimes with all plants, but especially succulents, there's going to be some thick roots at the edge with yuccas and agaves and aloes. Sometimes they've already started to try to send some of those little pups or those offsets out, and they hit the edge of the pot really quickly and start looping around. You're going to want to make sure you either loosen those off, or if you snap those off, it's fine. So if I'm doing a lot of plants, or if the roots are denser, I like to use this tool that's in my hand. It's called a hori-hori. It's basically a mix between a utility knife. It has some sharpness to it, but it's not as sharp as a real knife, and a garden trowel. And one side of it is serrated, so it makes it really easy to just kind of shave off the roots at the end. You can also use something like an old steak knife or an old bread knife. Just be careful not to cut yourself. And then loosening the base just a little bit. And then sometimes when you do that, you'll lose a little bit of that soil off the bottom. So I always first put that plant back into the ground carefully, make sure the level is still right. So it's going to be just a little bit above ground. And you might notice on this, there's a little bit of slope in the yard going down this way. And Dudleya's like really, really perfect drainage. They often grow in cliffs. So with Dudleya's, if I'm planting them in the ground, I'll actually plant it just a little bit diagonal as well to really make sure that root ball is never sitting in soil. And so the backside's a little taller. And then start backfilling. And I'll use my shovel to work some soil around. And then before it's totally full, I'll reach down and I'll firm up the soil a little bit around the edges of the roots, because you want to make sure that there's good contact between the soil and the edge of your pot's root ball, no big air pockets. And then continue. And one of the reasons why I like these flexible tubs in the garden is because for things like finishing off the hole, it's really easy to pick them up and you can kind of flex it to make a spout and just get the soil right where you want it. Pat it down. And then I always encourage people, and what I do myself, especially in this part of the garden, I don't have an irrigation system. I only hose water. So especially when things are young, a watering mound. And so you can see I took some extra soil from the hole. I needed to grab a little bit from elsewhere in my yard. And on the downhill side, I made this little berm, this little mound in this ring. If you're on totally flat ground, you'd make a full kind of donut, but this area is a little bit upslope, so water's never going to leave off of the top anyways. And then immediately give things a good watering in. And you always want to do this first watering in with a hose, even if it's going to be like on a drip system right away, because this first watering as it goes in is going to firm up the soil. It'll help collapse air pockets, all sorts of good things. The first watering after planting is going to be the most important watering the plant ever gets. And so I will do that and let the water drain in. And I'll do that 3 times at least when I'm watering it for the first time. That's also what I do if I'm watering an area with no irrigation system, just with the hose, which you can do with the succulent garden. Oftentimes, a mistake that I find people are making is they're watering too often and not deep enough, or just when they do water, it's not deep enough. You really want to make sure that water penetrates. And so this plant, after it's established, might only get watered once a month with a hose, but I'll water it kind of 3 times in a row for a while to make sure that I'm really getting that water to penetrate down through the root ball. And then our other planting example is going to be planting from cuttings or pups. So one of the cool things about working with succulents is that it can be relatively economical because a lot of them are really easy to root or to propagate yourself. You don't need special equipment at all. And so this is a plant that is a little bit what you might call leggy or stemmy if you were buying it. This was sitting for quite a while from plants that had been rooted from our demonstration garden, and it was sitting in our little nursery area at work. But this is not just one plant. If you're going to cut it apart, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 plants, even 13 with this little one, just in this 1 gallon pot. And so here's the process. And so this is a Graptivaria or a Graptosedum. It's kind of hard to tell by looking at them. They're closely related. But one of the many cool, best in some afternoon or part shade, or in a pot in part shade in our area, one of the many cool smaller succulents. But the vast majority of succulents work the same way. So this is going to be true for these plants, the aeoniums, all the way up to agaves and aloes. So you can even see this is this part right here. The stem is already setting out roots, even though it's not even in an area where those roots can get into the ground. That's how much the stems of this plant want to root. And so if this gets cut, each one of these little swollen bud areas has the potential to put down roots. And so what you're going to do is you're going to cut and leave. You can leave much less stem than this and it'll be fine. But if I have a couple inches of stem, even for these small plants, I will use it, because to me, that's just more roots and it's pretty easy to dig the hole. So you have something like this. And after you make your cuttings, and it's best, some gardeners just snap off the stems, and that's okay, but really it's like a wound. You're doing surgery. So I always encourage people to use sharp, clean pruners, because it's just gonna heal up that much better and grow that much healthier. So after you do your cuttings, no matter what size of your plants, what you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna put these in the shade somewhere for, in general, for a small plant like this, like 3 days or so. You want to basically let this fresh wound kind of dry out some and callus a little bit. So something like this, 3 days in the shade this time of year should be just fine, just so it's not fresh and wet, and that could be a little prone to rotting. Now, if you're really trying to propagate a lot of these, you can actually carefully twist off the leaves and lay these leaves on the soil with the right amount of moisture. You're going to want to do it in potting soil in like a controlled situation in some shade, and you can get each one of these to root, but it's going to take a lot longer for these to grow into a viable plant. If you're interested in that, there's plenty of tutorials on YouTube about propagating succulents from leaves, so you can just search for that. Lots of information about propagating succulents online. And so with our cuttings that we've had in the shade for a little bit, we're going to be adding some into this area of this garden. So start by pulling back the mulch. And then you don't need to dig a big hole just to get these cuttings rooted into the ground. So I'll like to use my hori-hori. For something like this, you can use that, a small trowel, even just like a screwdriver or something. It's easier just to make a little place to stick the stem in than to dig a whole big hole and then have to backfill that soil while you're holding the stems. And so with my hori-hori knife, just kind of pull that forward to expose a little narrow hole. Slide that stem in, and then I'll use my fingers to firm things up to make sure I have good contact between the stem and the soil. And then maybe add in a few more, and there you go. And that, water it once a week when it's young, and then taper it off to less than that over time. This is in an area where it'll get afternoon shade, and there you go. It is literally that simple. And so if your friend has a huge pot of these or a big bush of this, ask them if you can take a few cuttings, and you don't even need to buy anything at the nursery. Planting in pots works the exact same way. The big thing is that you're going to need to make sure your pots have adequate drainage. So the pot needs a hole in the bottom for the water to drain out for really any plants, but especially succulents. And if it's a nice looking pot, but only a tiny hole, if it's ceramic, you need to do it very carefully, but you might consider drilling out wider holes. If it's plastic, that's pretty easy to do with a drill and a decent sized drill bit. In general, even if the plants are, cacti and well adapted, you don't necessarily want to put tiny pots in full blazing sun all day. Sometimes I've done that like on an outdoor table with a cactus. You just need to keep a much more of an eye on it, because that soil could just get bone dry a little bit quicker. And then you're going to want to either use a ready to go cactus mix. Here's a couple of brands. There's a lot of different brands. It's basically the same as potting soil, but they just put more fast draining materials in it. And then one of those materials is perlite, which is a natural volcanic compound that then is superheated. It's basically like a mineral popcorn that holds a lot of air and just a little bit of water. So it creates a very well draining soil. And some of the recommendations for long-term care of succulents in pots is to use about half something like this cactus mix soil and about half perlite. So you're putting in even more perlite. In practice, most of the succulents I've grown in pots, I just use the cactus mix and it works fine. Sometimes I'll add in more perlite if I have it around. If you're going to be using a large pot that'll have a large specimen over time though, I definitely would encourage you to do the 50% perlite mix, because our compost-based potting soils, you might have experienced this if you've grown much in pots, they really over time kind of break down and lose volume. And if you have a small potted plant, that's not a big deal. But if you have like a big, tree aloe in a pot or something like that, that's kind of big and heavy, you don't want it to lose stability or have to be repotting it more often than you need to, just because the soil's losing volume. So the extra perlite will help with that. Barbara, I just saw, came in with a question about what about using perlite with clay soil? And in theory, it helps, but you would need to add so much perlite into the soil that most people aren't going to do it. So if you're gonna add a lot in, that can help, but you always need to think, you don't just need to amend like the top few inches of soil. You need to think about where the bottom of the roots are going to be. And you have to amend to lower than the bottom of the roots. Because if you amend to just right where the bottom of the roots are, you're kind of creating like a bathtub kind of situation. And so that's why it's tricky. And you really need to add a lot of well-draining material quite deep. And so if people are going to do that, why people often use decomposed granite is because that does help the drainage and it's cheap to buy a lot of it. It can be pretty expensive to buy that much perlite to actually do in a garden. So if you are going to be planting in pots, over time, those roots, like we talked about, and if they've been in the nursery containers for too long, will start to circle and can get tighter and tighter. So in general, plan to repot things every few years. And that would be taking them out of the pots, trimming the outer circling roots, and maybe replacing like a third of the outer soil and having it reroot from the root ball. Or if you're dealing with small things like the Graptavarias that we looked at, you can just snap them off and reroot them if you want to. It's up to you. And then for planting in pots, you're going to be watering a bit more than if the plants were in the ground. So for the average pot in full sun, maybe about once a week. And that's just a general starting point. You're going to have to kind of just trial and error what's going to work for you based on your exact sun and how much soil you have, what kind of soil you have. And then if growing them indoors, again, as much sun as possible. So we're going to talk a little bit about irrigation, and then we'll be shifting more into the design part of things and looking at pretty pictures. So for irrigation, with succulents, there's a difference between survival, looking good, and looking good plus growing as fast as possible to have impressive sized specimens in your garden of these plants. In general, with well-draining soil, you're going to be watering new plantings deeply 2 to 4 times a month, and then 1 to 2 times a month for well-established plantings. In general, you can think of, the first year is going to be establishment, and then after that, if things look like they're growing well, you can consider them pretty well established after the first year. If you have less than perfectly draining soil, keep an eye on things if you are doing that once a week watering. But if you're in one of those Cucamonga properties that's growing in rock, you'll have plenty of drainage in most cases. Just realize that if something's starting to look funky with your succulents, other than just a little bit of a shriveling up, but if something's starting to really look off or discolored, poke around in the soil some, because more people will kill their succulents by overwatering than underwatering. However, succulents don't want to just be put in the ground and abandoned for the most part. And then, as we just talked about, plants and pots will need to be a little bit more. In general, like the people I've known who have run the horticulture for succulent plantings and gardens and botanical gardens, find that for most stuff, other than the rare oddball stuff, they're watering about twice a month in the summer, which is more than maybe maximum water conservation. But in those botanical garden situations, they're really trying to make sure they get those impressive size specimens. So just wanted to give that to you as a little bit of a baseline for figuring out what you might want to do. And then for everything, as you're starting to figure out your irrigation schedule, you're going to want to spend some time with your hands in the soil. Before you water again, you're going to want to check the soil at least 2 inches down, if not 4 inches down, and make sure that it feels dry. Just because it feels dry 2 inches down, sometimes with sandy soils and this heat, 2 inches down, it's going to feel dry and it's not time to water yet. But definitely, if you check 2 inches down and it still feels moist, it's not time to water your succulents. Again, same thing for native and most of the Waterwise plant material. And this really becomes important as we're getting towards like the fall when the days are shorter, or certainly in the rainy season after it's rained. And there's no real, if it's rained some and the weather's really in that changing kind of phase, there's no real perfect guidelines. So you just want to make sure that things have dried out quite a bit. For irrigation, if you have a small succulent garden, you can definitely just water with a hose. If you have a spray system that's working for you well, there's nothing that says you can't use a spray system. Maybe make sure that it's very efficiently watering, but that can work for succulents. However, if you're going to have to be putting in a new irrigation system, what we recommend is inline drip irrigation as the most efficient and lowest maintenance way to water succulents. And so this is different than the stuff where there's individual like button emitters and you put 1 or 2 at the base of each plant, and there's the thicker half-inch line and then the little quarter-inch spaghetti tube. We find that those systems tend to fall apart. They're just not durable. And as soon as something falls apart, the pressure on those systems are off. They just don't work well. We have a program that I'll mention a little bit later at the Waterwise Community Center, where we will go to people's houses and inspect their irrigation system and give them a report with recommendations on how to improve efficiency and save water. And our team that does that has literally never seen one of those systems that hasn't fallen apart somewhere and gone undetected by the homeowner. So this inline drip irrigation, you buy a roll, either a 100-foot roll or a 500-foot roll. For most homeowners, a 100-foot roll, even if you need more than 500 feet to do a large area, 100-foot rolls are easier to work with. And in here, you might be able to see these little dots. Every so often, usually, and especially for the rocky soils in most of Rancho Cucamonga, it's going to be every 1 foot down the line, you're going to see these dots, and that's where the emitters are already embedded into the line. So they're not just holes in the line, but as you can see in the lower right, they're these highly engineered little doodads that give out a regulated amount of water and balance the pressure at each of these holes along the line. And so for small areas like this on the left, there's just no way to water that area efficiently with spray irrigation. What you're going to want to have is converting to drip irrigation. And then you can use this for larger areas as well. It's more detailed than we can get into this evening. However, we do have online at our YouTube page, cbwcd.org/YouTube, a whole 3-hour drip irrigation design and installation workshop for homeowners that's taught by Brandon Burgess, who is our conservation program specialist and an irrigation expert. So I'd encourage you to check that out for really learning how to set this up for yourself at home. And then if you're going to be watering with a hose, whether it's containers or a small garden, that's fine, but be sure to water deeply. And there is a tool that you will want to get, which is a watering wand with a water breaker is what this is called. There are cheaper and much more expensive versions of these. Whichever version you get, there are some that advertise that they're telescoping and they have a little plastic union that you can screw apart and make wider. Those things fall apart. There's a few different brands. DRAM, D-R-A-M-M, is one brand that's sold at a whole bunch of different places, but that's kind of the industry standard. And at different price points, they sell things to professionals where a setup like this, it wouldn't be purple, would cost like $60. And then I've seen decent quality ones all the way down to like $15. They have a little valve that you can adjust the flow. They have the wand part that extends where you're watering, and they have the breaker. And the specialized breaker for watering plants or gardens is what's important to water efficiently and water well. It makes a nice soft flow. There's different sizes. Sometimes they have different flow rates. But the important thing is that you're using something like this, where you see that there's a pattern of holes all across the surface of the thing that's putting out water, the face of this breaker. Because what often people who are trying to water their garden with a hose is they'll go to their garage and they'll have something like this, which is one of those like 8 adjustable patterns. These things are great for washing your car. But what happens is that if you put this on the shower, which is what most people would do, and it looks like this, from the side, this doesn't look that different to the spray that this has. However, if you look in the middle, because it has all these adjustments, it's only one outer ring of holes that's putting out water. And it will take you forever to water a garden by hand with that, as opposed to something like this, where the whole face of the whole face of this surface has those holes to have that right soft watering pattern for plants. It will take you literally probably 4 times as long to water your garden with this. So I always like to mention that because that's new information for a lot of people. And then other maintenance tips. I will probably mention this again, but keep your maintenance minimal for succulents by sticking to right plant, right place. If you plan for that, your maintenance will be minimal. Plan for the mature size of those plants, and especially near walkways, driveways, and sidewalks. When your blooms fade and dry out, you can deadhead them. With a lot of succulents, especially like aloes, when those blooms dry out, the stem dries out, and you can just kind of pull them off of the plant and they separate very easily. You don't even need to reach down into the rosette with pruners. For some species, you'll want to take those cuttings and reroot when they start getting stemmy or leggy. And then all gardens will have some ongoing weeding, checking irrigation, things like that. One of the easiest ways to go wrong with the look of a succulent garden is to not do any weeding, and then all of a sudden the succulents have been taken over with weeds. Absolutely avoid this. This is so common because these agaves, they're like alligators. They look so cute when they're small, and you bring them home in the pot, and then 3 years later, they're huge and have sharp teeth, and they're poking people in the leg here. And when this happens, this plant will never look good again. They should have just ripped this plant out of the ground. The other thing that you sometimes see happen is that these will get cut all the way back, and eventually, this is still too close to even make it work, but eventually they'll start to look like pineapples. And unless you like the look of that, I think it ruins a lot of what's nice looking about these plants. And then the other thing to watch out for in terms of top things to watch out for on aloes is aloe mite. And that's a tiny little insect that causes this almost like cancerous looking growth and can spread from aloe to aloe. And so if you see this show up on any of your aloes, you want to deal with it. Some species tend to be more prone than others. It's just something that's around. And if you see this, what you want to do is you just want to cut off below the infected part. And if it's an aloe, like that might mean the whole, sometimes you can just do it on a leaf or a couple of leaves. Sometimes it's the whole branch. Occasionally it's the whole plant. Usually it's not that if you get it early. And then what you want to do is you want to then, you don't want to put it in the green bin where it might spread. You want to wrap that up, ideally double bag it in black plastic trash can, tie it off, and then just put it in your normal trash. And then before we jump into design, we'll talk about something that kind of is related to design, but it's also related to just your basic choices in your garden and plant health and saving water, is how you cover the ground minimally so you don't have as many weeds coming up in your garden. You're normally going to want to cover the ground with some sort of mulch. And sometimes people think mulch means wood chips, but mulch just means anything covering the soil. And so with succulents, you have 3 main choices, one of which is gravel, one of which is decomposed granite, and one of which is a wood chip mulch. And then oftentimes people are adding accents of cobblestone and boulders, etc. So this is decomposed granite. It's also commonly used for pathways or patios. It's the closest mulch you would have to a kind of a surface. In pathways, you usually buy it with an ingredient that's called a binder, and it's compacted. and then usually get it without the binder and just lay it down in garden areas as mulch. It gets a very nice desert look. It doesn't do as good of a job of preventing weed seeds from germinating as some of the other ones, but it's very easy to use like a hoe or other tools to hoe up the weeds in decomposed granite mulch. And it's great on flat areas, but on slopes, because it's kind of like a coarse sand, which is, it's not sandy because it's angular, so you don't sink in it like sand if you're walking through it, but it's kind of like a coarse sand. So if it's on a slope and there's rain, it tends to erode. So best for close to flat areas, but that's decomposed granite. And if you're interested in where to get all of this stuff, on the website where you can download the PDF of this, cbwcd.org/presentations. We also have a local landscape suppliers list, and it will have lists of landscape supply companies where you can get decomposed granite and gravel and wood chip mulch and the cobbles and boulders and things. So this is wood chip mulch on the right. This is in a garden where the walking areas also had gravel and decomposed granite, but wood chip mulch. And oftentimes, wood chip mulch would be used in a succulent garden, usually not for the look, but in this garden, for example, it's mostly native and waterwise plants and then some succulents as a sculptural accents. Or sometimes you can often get mulch for free or wood chip mulch for free from tree trimmers. Sometimes cities or water agencies give it away. We have had on hold, but we're about to reintroduce it with some changes, a free mulch giveaway at the Waterwise Community Center in Montclair. And so if you're doing this on a limited budget and you don't have budget to work with something more ornamental for your succulent gardens, that wood chip mulch is just a fine way to go. And then finally, gravel. And I think this is a really beautiful project. This was designed and installed by the homeowner, actually in Rancho Cucamonga, who just came in to visit our demonstration one day and showed me this picture of his garden on his phone. And I thought it was the most beautiful textured mulching that I had seen in a residential garden. So I begged him to text me this picture. And so you can see it's gravel, but it's not that kind of stereotypical wall-to-wall gravel with a couple of cactuses, just something out of a bag where it's all the same size and it looks monotonous. You can see it's a combination of pea gravel and then some smaller cobble mixed in, and he mixed in some boulders in this dry stream bed. And then he has this other area over there with decomposed granite as well. So it's and then some flagstone through the gravel for this path. So it's very dynamic, it's very natural looking. And I would encourage you to think about your mulch layer or your ground covering layer as a design element and something that's going to help make a visual statement with your garden, as well as preventing weeds. And so, yeah, put some thought into that, and really definitely mixing different rock sizes, but sticking with our tone of our local native kind of washed river rock is going to be generally the best way to go. Those fancier bad gravels, or quote fancier, they're just fine if you're getting a little bit of ornamental gravel to like cover the top of some pots. But once you get it into a landscape situation, because it's normally all the exact same size or very close, it looks kind of artificial. Where if you work with the more local materials, you can get it from the local landscape supply yards, usually in a whole variety of different sizes. And so you can really get a beautiful natural look. Unless you are intentionally going for this as your look, avoid situations like this. Most of us do not want to end up with something like this. And I don't say that to make fun of anybody. There's obviously some care put into it. The paving on this brick is done pretty nice. But when I say think about mulch in terms of your design, I'm thinking about it in terms of something like this, not usually patterns with different colors of gravel and then just a few succulents. I think in practice, working with very contrasting colors of gravel in these bold patterns looks better on a drawing of a design than it actually does in person long term. And so for the last part of the workshop, we're going to look at design with succulents. Two huge ideas. A design that you're going to love for your home, something that you're going to see every day, is more than a collection of random plants in a sea of gravel. It's usually not one of this, one of this, one of that, one of this, unless you're a passionate plant collector. And if that's what you're about, then go for it. But usually it's something other than that. And we'll look at some great examples right now. And also, if you're into succulents, and one of the reasons why they're great is because they can take full blasting sun, a number of them. But if it's your home, you'll also want to remember to include some trees and shade, because we want our houses to be livable spaces. And there's some great desert trees and companion plants for succulents that will work very well with that. And so here is, we're just going to kind of look at a series of gardens with succulents that have some different aspects that I find inspiring. Some of these, because of what's a lot, kind of published online and in books, are some very high-end properties. Some of these are very high-end properties. Some of them are public gardens, but at the end, we'll end with a small series of gardens with succulents that are just local pictures I've taken of front yards. But some of these larger, fancier gardens where they have rocks that would have taken a crane to put down and we might not be doing at home have some great lessons for us. I think this is a really nice balanced dry garden where we have a tree. This is a Palo Verde tree. We'll see plenty of other ones because they are true desert trees and they work very well with succulent gardens. They are a nice size, maxing out at like 25 feet. They grow pretty quickly. They have nice yellow flowers and they provide a very dappled shade, which is comfortable to be in, but allows enough sun to garden underneath, even with things that traditionally want full sun. And I really like this balance of this ground cover rosemary on the right, which provides a kind of shrubbier balance to the golden barrel cactus in the front, used as a group to make a statement. And then some of these individual specimens, as well as repeating forms as well. And so you can see with the yuccas, another thing that I like that is usually successful in succulent gardens is you want to work with repetition in some way, shape, or form. That doesn't mean all the same plant. So it might be all the same plant like the golden barrel, but here there's yucca, different species of yucca, and a plant called a Fucaria, which is a different species, but it's kind of echoing that form in a different way. Then you can see like bougainvillea in the background, also softening the look. This is at Sunnylands, which is a kind of public garden in terms of the, you can go visit it for their main gardens. It's a historic property. Now presidents kind of have retreats there and things like that, but working in dramatic drifts. So remember I mentioned that one of the cool ways to use aloe vera is just in a big, bold statement. So something like that. And that is something that you can do on a residential scale all the way along the walk up to your front door or something like that. And even here where the blooms have started to fade, even just the dried sticks are making a statement. And you can see the swaths of other plants in the back, these little golden barrel cactuses here. If you do a whole huge area with golden barrel cactuses that close, that's going to cost quite a bit to put in. But aloes, you can kind of start farther apart. And because they self-propagate, you can really make a statement without needing to break the bank. And this is a younger, one of those Palo Verde trees I just mentioned. Here's another example of that same kind of approach. And then a repetition of forms here with the containers, and then a very eclectic collection. So this is one of the cases sometimes where one of this and one of that can work. But look here still where the agaves, that kind of generally repeated form is still kind of grouped together. And then the more mounded or round cactuses are kind of grouped together to still kind of not have complete chaos for the eye. And then the ones in the background have stands. And so it's creating kind of a nice layering effect. When you're working with pots, you might choose to work with larger pots that have a single specimen. So this is a young dragon tree, which eventually would get quite large and too large for a pot, but grows very slowly. And then in medium-sized pots, you might have some contrasting plants. So you might have a couple of different plants and maybe one that goes more up and one that maybe spills over. Could be very modern and minimal, just choosing the right plants. So in this design here, we have the Fucaria species, which would need a kind of large area, but this isn't a huge area, but just doing your right plant, right place, the size, and then one plant for the background, one plant, which is, I believe, that blue glow agave that we looked at for the middle, and then a ground cover succulent sedum, all with contrasting colors. is, if you're into that modern minimal look, something beautiful. And you don't need to necessarily have the multi-million-dollar house to do that in your garden. Or something that's more naturalistic. So this is Morton Botanic Garden in the Southern California desert. And you can see, even though there's cacti, mixing a number of different species of desert trees to provide kind of a shaded, welcoming walk and a structure for a very eclectic plant collection. They also have a very eclectic potted plant collection. I really love this, focusing on a collection of plants that have white hairs. And these are kind of things you can get if you go to specialty nurseries, like, for example, California Cactus Center or those botanical garden sales events. You can start to develop a whole kind of collection. And then on the right, working with what I called groups and echoes. So again, different plants, but we have a small kind of beaver-tailed cactus or a Opuntia genus cactus with a different species that's much larger. And here we have some agaves with different tones of their foliage, slightly different sizes, but kind of grouped together still, not just random, and it holds together the design. Working with contrasting color and form is something that is huge about getting kind of maximum impact, if that's what you're looking for out of a small succulent design. And that can happen in containers or in the ground. Here, looking at, again, similar form, here's a Graptivaria with 2 aeoniums, but such different coloration. And then on the lower right, something that some people are into is this almost succulent kind of tapestry garden. This can be very beautiful. I prefer to see this in public gardens because it's very labor intensive to do in an actual home garden, because these things are always growing. And so they need to be reset or split apart and replanted pretty much every year as these things grow in. So if you're going to do something like this, the maintenance isn't that, the maintenance isn't that complicated. It doesn't need a ton of water or anything. In our area, most of the plants that go into some of these things are going to need part shade, but just realize you're going to be constantly rerooting, splitting things apart, things like that. And then to get things going at the beginning, it takes a lot of plants. So it's kind of expensive to get going. Some people like the style of succulent gardening where it's almost like you're in an aquarium, an underwater seascape. And that's all about bold colors, contrasting forms, and then ground covers. So working with sedums and the ice plants and senaceos. And one kind of tip if you're going to do something like this is you want to make sure that your ground covers have enough contrast with what they're underneath, or else things will start to kind of muddy together. So it doesn't need to be a huge contrast, as you can see here, but just enough so that things pop. One great thing about succulents is that they are very fire-wise. Because they have that water in their leaves, they're really not flammable. In fact, some people say they can even, help hold back or fight fire because there's all that moisture there. And they are generally pretty good at holding hillside. So this is a completely eclectic kind of fire-wise hillside, or sometimes just the simple repetition is all you need to make the statement that you're going for. I really like the work of this landscape architecture firm based in San Francisco and Los Angeles called Terremoto. They do some very high-end projects, and they're kind of masters at working with subtle form and texture. So you can see here, there's that color contrast, but it's much more subtle tones. To me, this is a much more graceful look than the real bright contrast, which if that's what you're into, then that's great too. But just want to show you different options. And then the arching forms of that octopus agave. This is not in Inland Empire. This is more in Los Angeles formal. So it's not quite as much really, really hot summer heat. And then working with different sedums as well, and some other different ground covers. Here, it's that same project, an area that's a little bit more diverse, working with different agaves and aloes as well, and even some native dahlias. And then this is another landscape architect who I really admire. He's more active in the Arizona area, and he does some stuff, I think, into the California true desert. But I really think he's a master at the naturalistic kind of desert form, which which if you're going to be working with succulent plants, I really like. So working with desert trees, Palo Verdes and desert willows being kind of the top two, and then working in the shade underneath and in the openings with, again, diversity, but really working carefully with echoing similar plants where it's needed to create a sense of form. And then he really goes into detail with very naturalistic, but really nice looking mulches. So maybe starting with decomposed granite, but then adding in swaths of stone on top of it or different gravels, so that the result is very naturalistic, but it's complex enough to be very pleasing to the eye. And then again, relying on that bold contrast. And then working with things like gravel and stone, you can have things like this where patio spaces then kind of sweep into planters, and maybe the rock is a little bit bigger in some areas of the planters, but it's a very graceful transition. And sometimes one tree is all you need to then make the succulent collection here in this courtyard area right underneath, and at the sides really pop. Trees can make all the difference. Also showing contrast. I really like desert gardens or succulent gardens that then integrate some wildflowers. So this is a California native wildflower, Balia is what it's called. And that will just kind of seed around and just works really great in what would otherwise be open mulch areas. And here you see again, rosemary, which just happens to work very well as a dark background contrast to our succulents. Or here, just working with some contrasting agaves, mostly, and then some little ground cover succulents as just a foreground strip with then taller and more shrubby and grassy background. And sometimes the succulents can just be the accent in an otherwise waterwise garden. So here's more of a Mediterranean with the arbutus strawberry tree. There's some native grasses and white sage. And then because that's a kind of very loose landscape, just using the succulents here, there's that aloe blue flame, or not, agave blue flame that we mentioned at the beginning. So that's this, and just kind of pattern here and there to provide a sense of structural form that loosely pulls through the landscape. I'm really a fan of this landscape. And so we're going to spend our last few minutes before we jump into finishing the questions with some local examples. And we're going to start with a couple of ones that I think are less strong designs. And again, not showing you it to make fun of everybody or anybody, but just because this is often where I see homeowners and do-it-yourselfers go, and it's not as strong of a design. So just wanted to start this with a positive note of a couple of very pretty plants. So here is a local landscape where there's obviously some effort put into it, but where I feel like this maybe went wrong from having a more powerful design is too much repetition of form. So everything is that rosette of the agave or the aloe. Some of them clump, but there's no contrast to really make things pop. It's too much, too close, in my opinion, aesthetically. Or then another thing that you sometimes will find is just kind of that random assortment. And if that's someone just getting going and then they're going to be propagating their plants, that's just fine. But oftentimes you see things kind of show up and look kind of random, where this might be contrasted with, in the same neighborhood, this landscape. And obviously this landscape had quite a bit more budget. It has the decomposed granite with some boulders, but a lot of the plants in this landscape, just purely talking about design, a lot of the plants here, the aloes and agaves, or sorry, the aeoniums here, purple aeoniums, and then some of the same species of agaves are here. But this design to me pops a lot more, where here the aeoniums are on both sides of the path, but not right across from each other, kind of loose but flanking. And then the large agave, this one might end up getting too large for the space, but the large agave, and then echoing kind of that more clumped agave form, working with some other plants as well that are not succulents to kind of provide that further contrast. Succulents do really well on those really difficult to garden in parkway strips. We already talked about that. So here's 2 Palo Verde desert trees, which will provide nice shade, a couple of golden barrels and a couple of agaves with gravel and boulders. That will work just great. And this is another one of those things where the area where people can walk across blends seamlessly because of the mulching into the planted areas. Here we have integrating succulents with native plants, succulents in the ground cover with this blue finger and some aloes as accents in Pomona. And then this house also worked with the decomposed granite, the boulders, and then those boulders just kind of protecting a few aloes in a park strip area, which again allows people to easily walk back and forth. And then this is one of my favorite front yard succulent gardens I've ever seen, a combination of desert specimens and California native and Mediterranean shrubs. To me, this is like botanical garden, beautiful. But if it was all succulents, it wouldn't pop as much as that balance between the colorful desert shrubs, waterwise shrubs, and the succulents. That's really lovely. Some areas are denser, some areas are a little more open to get in and be able to do the maintenance. And then again, another example of a mostly native and waterwise front yard, but this is looking great in the spring. This time of year, there will be less color. Some of the things might be a little bit more tired looking. And so the succulents, the agave here, and then the little agave here as it grows in will provide some kind of year-round sculptural aspect. And then the last example that I have as we get towards the end is an example of a north facing, so shadow most of the year and then full blasting sun in the summer. This is at a restaurant and hotel in the San Fernando Valley, North Hollywood, so very similar climate. And this kind of large seascape area, it's kind of rambunctious, kind of close together, but working with that foxtail agave and aloes. And this might be a little wild for you. It might be just perfect. Eventually they'll have to thin this out some, but for something that probably only needs to be watered no more than twice a month, probably can get about watered once a month on the north side. This is absolutely beautiful for the parking lot of a restaurant. I think that's gorgeous. So I included these, not because we have time to talk about all of them in this workshop, but just for you to reference. And then if you want to look up the plant profiles on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, you can get more information about all of them. But these are some of my very favorite companion plants to work with succulent plants. These are all very compatible in terms of watering and horticulture. So we have a couple of trees, our Palo Verde and our desert willow. And then these are my favorite shrubs that go really well with succulents: Brittlebush, Baja fairy duster, Palmer's mallow. A lot of these are really great at attracting butterflies or hummingbirds to the garden. We have desert mallow, mountain marigold, which also smells amazing, patchy plume, which gets these very feathery seed pods, very beautiful, desert milkweed, and then some smaller plants, firecracker penstemon, desert marigold, which is that wildflower that will spread around. And so just to finish up, and then please stick around for just a minute to answer our survey, and then I will answer all of the questions. So for Barbara, I know I did go through those last slides very quickly. Again, that's mostly there for you to be able to download them, or you can go back through the YouTube, but I can go back through a few of them in question and answer if you need me to. But I want to mention, as we conclude, just a few of our other programs you might be interested in. So we have now a residential landscape design assistance program where I will help you design either a front yard or a backyard for your house that meets our program requirements. The full requirements are at cbwcd.org/design assistance. But basically, the first thing you will do is attend a class we teach as a Zoom workshop like this once a month. With that, you can apply for the program. It's free, but we have a $100 fully refundable deposit after you put in a Waterwise garden within a year of participating in the program. And we will work with you. You'll provide us site measurements and pictures, and we'll come up with a planting plan for you and advice on where to put things like dry stream beds, different mulches to use, landscape materials, and you'll choose one of 8 different themes to start with. We'll make sure that it works for you. And so those are those 8 themes that I showed at the top of the Inland Valley Garden Planner. So if you're interested, you can check out that website and get the full information. And then the program that I mentioned, where we will send staff to your house and evaluate your home watering system, make recommendations. We also look at your current watering schedule, your plant material, and give you a schedule that will water your landscape efficiently based on the best health of your material and your best health of the plants that you have, and your watering system that you have, exactly how fast it puts out water. And that program is currently on hold. We're working on coming up with new protocols because we do need to go to your house. In most cases, we need to go into the garage and operate someone's irrigation controller. So we're working on new protocols and safety measures, logistics related to COVID. We want to make sure that we're doing that very safely for everybody, including our staff. But if you're interested, we do have a waiting list or an interest list for us to be able to help people who are interested as soon as we get back into gear on that. And so you can find out the information about that and see an example report at cbwcd.org/leap. And then there is also an installation program to get a free smart irrigation timer that will automatically adjust to the weather and help save water. That is actually through Cucamonga Valley Water District. So Socorro, I'm sure during our question and answer, if people are interested, can provide you with the contact information for where to get started with that. I'm not sure if it's Socorro or if it's somebody else there. So with that, we will end with the slide of local sources for succulents and companions as we will go into question and answer. One quick thing I wanted to show as well, and I will switch back to this slide after we do question and answer for a little bit, is a couple of good websites. This is one that is has a list of clubs and public gardens that have succulent gardens that you can go visit. And the clubs are the different enthusiast clubs if you want to learn more about succulents. And then Deborah Lee Baldwin is an author who has written a number of books on succulents, and she has a great website with lots of information and lots of videos about succulents. So that's deborahleebaldwin.com. And so with that, thank you for joining us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to launch the closing poll. And this is really important information. We are really wanting to make sure that these workshops are useful for you. And in addition to just these few open, multiple choice questions, if you have any other comments, things that worked for you, things that didn't work for you, things that you think we could do better, please type them into the chat and let us know. We read all of them and we really value your feedback. We definitely want to make sure that these workshops are as useful for you as possible. And so with that, I will turn it over to Socorro if she has anything else that she wants to add in before we finish up. And then I will go back and start answering any of the last questions we have.
Thank you, Scott, for your presentation tonight. I just want to remind everyone that we do have a workshop next month, Butterflies and Songbird Gardens, on October 8th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. I will be sending that information out in an email on Monday. And 3 lucky participants who attend our workshop will be placed in a drawing for an opportunity to win a high efficiency toilet with installation provided by San Antonio Water Company. And again, we do have programs. If you have any questions, I will write that information or phone number on the chat box. But you can also check out the programs on SoCalWatersmart.com for turf removal rebates and residential rebates. And again, thank you for tuning in. We will be raffling 2 succulent plants tomorrow at 10 a.m. So follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, to see who wins. You will be contacted as well. Scott?
Well, thank you very much, Socorro. And so let's go through questions, starting with Kira. Do we grow any succulents or cacti from seed, or are the majority bought from nurseries? In theory, it can be done from seed, but it takes a very, very long time. So usually that's something being done by a professional propagator or an extreme enthusiast. So most of them are either bought from nurseries, or you can get those pups, those offsets or cuttings from your friends or people in your neighborhood with permission or something like that. cuttings works very well, especially if you have a large area, if you're on a budget. From Joyce, do I know anyone who might want one of those huge cactuses, 8 to 10 feet wide and high, planted 3 feet from the street? Yeah, very difficult to deal with. No, I do not. And even those are usually very expensive to move, to do it well, or take a lot of effort. So right plant, right place. How do we find out more info about the program that evaluates the home watering system? We just had that. Pressure rate from Fabio, pressure regulators 2. Yes, they're from Fabio. You might be referring to the pressure regulation program from Cucamonga Valley Water District, which I don't mention as often because it doesn't apply to quite as many people, but I will mention it as well. Cucamonga Valley does have a pressure regulator program where if the house does not have a pressure regulator and if there is excessive pressure at the house, they will have a contractor put in a pressure regulator, which may or may not cover the garden. It is mostly for the domestic water in the house. It just depends on how the property was originally plumbed. It's probably slightly less than a 50% chance that property that would also capture the landscape as well. And you can contact Socorro, put into the chat the main customer service number, or sorry, the Government and Public Affairs Department for questions regarding the program and to get set up for those. So you can check for that phone number. From Sheena, about tapestry gardens, are there certain pairs of just 2 succulents that are low maintenance together? Most of the time, the succulents used in tapestry gardens are going to be the echeverias, which there's many, many different varieties, but they're all pretty low maintenance, are some of the very popular ones for tapestry gardens. And then there's a couple of other closely related succulents, which are called either graptivarias or graptosedums. One of them is just a hybrid. Those are also common ones. So those might be your most common ones. Within those, there's many different choices, and the maintenance is all the same. So just go with what you can find and what you like. Any suggestions or recommendations on how to save plants from the early stages of rot? Example, agaves. Just immediately cut back on the water. And then if you need to, depending on how large the agave is, Kira, you could dig it up and replant it. And then if there's just some areas that are rotting, but enough roots or enough stem that it could reroot, then you're going to just cut things off, leave it in the shade for 3 or 4 days, and then replant it. But the main thing would be just change whatever situation that is causing it to rot right away. So if for some reason it's not planted high, it got planted low, water's rushing into it, whatever you need to do, just go for it, don't wait. And then make sure that you're not watering too often or too much, or that the water is not sitting there and not draining. So I'm also going to go back a few slides right now if people want to check out those additional resources.
Fine.
And let's see if there's anything else. Kira also posted in the chat a good link for succulents and cacti resources, which is worldofsucculents.com. And looks like I have answered all of the questions. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope you join us for additional workshops in the future. And make sure to sign up for the raffle for the succulent pot if you're interested. And I will hang out until almost everybody has left, just in case there's any more questions that are going to come in.